Hello and welcome to Breaking Bread with Rivaaj Maharaj, where nothing is off the table. For today's episode, I wanted to talk on the current situation in Cuba and the challenges faced by the Cuban citizens with the efforts by the current American administration to destabilize the Cuban regime. So without further ado, let's get into it. I've come across an article from the BBC, why Trump means the Cuban Revolution faces its biggest threat yet. And I do believe, I think the Bay of Pigs, I think that, the exploding cigars for Fidel Castro and, things like that, the sanctions, they've all gotten the Cuban regime to a point. But I think what the Trump administration is doing is actually all that on steroids. And that is why I believe that what Donald Trump is saying about the Cuban revolution facing its greatest crisis currently is accurate. I did a little podcast episode on the cancellation of the Havana cigar festival in Cuba this year, and it being postponed to a later date to be announced. I'll put that video up somewhere over here. The thing is, the Cuban economy has been hit. It has been hit very hard with American sanctions. And sanctions were imposed on countries that would then go on to trade with Cuba. Now, the ousting of Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela allowed the Americans to control the oil tap. And Venezuela was the country that accounted for at least, I think, something like 61% of oil sent to Cuba to help the people. And that tap has now been shut. So you find that oil going into Cuba is virtually non-existent. And traditional allies of Cuba, like Mexico, Venezuela can't do much now, China, Russia, Iran, none of them have stepped up to the table, which is why I keep coming back to this point. The world is in it for itself now. The Russians are mired in Ukraine. So I think it's wishful thinking when you assume that the Russians are then going to be actively involved in the war in Iran against the Americans when the Americans decide to launch their operations against the Iranian regime. Because the Russians are not going to sacrifice soldiers that they require in order for them to continue with their campaign in Ukraine. Likewise, the Chinese are not going to sacrifice soldiers that they are going to require, because the end game out of all this is the United States and China in a massive military conflagration. That's an inevitability. Trump is systematically shutting all the doors that are open, even a little tiny bit, to the Chinese. And he's going to box them in, pretty much like what was done to the Japanese during the Second World War, where their oil imports were hit. And it was a foregone conclusion that the Japanese would then go on and take the Americans on because they were being suffocated. And you find the same thing here happening with China. All these little moves around the globe are designed to lock down the Chinese. And when the Chinese are then isolated and they have no other option but to go into a military conflagration because it's do or die, Trump wants to know that the United States has eliminated any kind of assistance that would come from anywhere. And that's why he's shutting down all these doors. So with Cuba as well, you see, the Iranians are mired in their own issues. So, they're fighting for their own survival. They're not going to then go to the Cubans. And this article talks about, an exhibit in the Museum of the Revolution in Havana that is dedicated to conditions in Cuba prior to Fidel Castro coming into power and the Cuban Revolution. Because then, at that time, Cuba was governed by the military dictator Fulgencio Batista. And the guy was as corrupt as anything. The mafia in the United States, Meyer Lansky, they had free reign in Cuba. Cuba was their playground. And they lost big time when Castro moved into Cuba, which is why Sam Giancana helped swing the vote in Chicago for John F. Kennedy, because the Bay of Pigs occurred subsequently to him coming into power, because the mafia had lost too much in Cuba. And this exhibit in Havana talks about times and the lives the common man lived when Fulgencio Batista was in power. And it talks about a woman who is looking at that painting of someone cooking with firewood in a dirty, decrepit looking kitchen, because that was all they could have. And she says, but currently they're in the same position, if not worse. So you do see that the American sanctions are very effective. And this is why Trump says that this is the end game for Cuba, because there's not much more that can happen now. Mexico is, with this El Mencho thing, Sheinbaum was put in there by the cartels. She's now facing pressure from Trump. The American administration has managed to reclassify the cartels in Mexico as terrorist organizations, which then allows them to tackle the cartels head on in Mexico. So rather than that happening and Sheinbaum looking weak, she's taken out El Mencho. But, it's not a one-day thing. The corruption from the cartels in Mexico goes all the way up to the government. And I believe that Sheinbaum is in power only because she's had the blessings of the cartels. She plays politics with them and she gets to do the job. However, she is facing a really belligerent American administration. And if she knows that if she is not vociferously taking on the cartels and making changes, one morning she's going to wake up and find that the US Special Forces are operating right on her doorstep and doing her job for her, which then makes her impotent, makes her country a vassal of the United States, which it already is, and it becomes the 51st, 52nd, 53rd, whatever state of the United States. Trump is the type of person who, if you can't get your house in order, I'll come and do it for you. And that's what you see happening in Mexico. Now, that is why you don't find all this aid. People, governments are terrified because it creates backlash in their country, and then they're suddenly overthrown by their own people because of dire economic situations. So, I do think that the Cuban Revolution is nearing its end. I think a regime change in Cuba is something that is on the cards. Trump is a hotelier. He's from the hospitality industry. When he looks at Cuba, he looks at, like he's seen Gaza, he looks at this Riviera, he looks at, properties, he looks at commerce, and that's all he sees. So, allowing somebody else to come in and take this land and redevelop it is not something he's too fond of. And don't forget, Cuba is in their backyard. Having a communist government in just off the shores of Florida is not going to do it for the Americans. And the fact that he's pivoting back to his neighborhood means that all these countries, El Salvador, Cuba, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Venezuela, they're all under the radar. As long as you play to the American administration's tune, you're fine. You don't, you step out of line, they'll be there to bring you back in. And that is the message that is being sent out. And it couldn't have been done in a better way than the fact that he is now abandoning Europe. When you see the Europeans running around and in disarray because the unthinkable has happened. The American benefactor, their godfather, the one country that they knew always had their back, has now told them, go it alone. That is something they never envisaged. And that is why all these European countries are scrambling to do deals all over the world and ramp up military production, because they know they've antagonized the Russians for too long, and now it's going to be payback. And when that payback comes, they need to be ready, because they're not 100% certain that the Americans will be there for them. If America is tied down in Iran, America is tied down off the coast of Venezuela, if America is tied down looking at other areas and preoccupied with China's expansion, they'll be more than happy to help let the Russians take whatever they want in Europe. Frankly, as I said in my previous videos, the Russians are deeply Orthodox Christians. Europe is moving away from those values. So, as a worst case scenario, the American administration will sit back and say, let the Russians have it. Maybe we'll have a more amicable government that we can deal with, one that shares our values and principles. Because as long as you had a Biden and an Obama and a Clinton administration in power with all this sickening woke agenda that they've been perpetuating and promulgating and forcing down and ramming down the throats of their populace, it was fine. But now you've got a government in the United States that is pro-Christian, pro-old values, pro-family, and everything anti-woke. There's no chance. There is absolutely no chance that Europe is going to align, because the value systems don't align. So I think, the Cuban economy, this article says, in free fall since the coronavirus pandemic. The Americans are looking at allowing a little bit of oil in just on a humanitarian grounds. But I think the writing is on the wall for the Cuban regime. However, saying that, they've withstood whatever the Americans have thrown to them or thrown at them over the last couple of decades. So, they have a resilience within them. But I think short of, which I think could go to a plus for them, barring everything but a military conflagration. However, I think the Americans know that, they'll probably weaken the government within Cuba and the system within Cuba to such a point that they'll just flood money into, the right people. There's a lot of Cuban expats in the United States that long for a change in Cuba, and they'll be more than happy to go in. There's a lot of companies looking to do business there. So, it's not difficult finding mercenaries to get into Cuba and do the dirty work for the American CIA. And I think that we will wake up one morning and find that the Americans are carrying out these operations in Cuba and Cuba is about to fall. I hope and pray for the Cuban people, because I don't care much for any of these governments. I think governments all over the world primarily have let their people down, and I think the people suffer. So, my heart goes out to the people of Cuba, and let's pray for their safety. So I want to thank you for spending time with us. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, as it helps us with the algorithm and it helps our channel to grow.